The aftermath of the interview arrived faster than Harry had anticipated. Within hours of broadcast, social media exploded with reactions ranging from supportive to scathing. British newspapers dedicated entire front pages to analyzing every word, gesture, and implication from his conversation. The divide in public opinion was stark, reflecting deeper tensions about tradition versus modernization that extended far beyond the royal family. Harry had expected controversy, but the intensity of the response surprised even him. Supporters praised his courage in speaking openly about mental health and family dysfunction, seeing his honesty as a breath of fresh air in an institution often criticized for being out of touch. Critics accused him of betraying his family's trust and undermining the monarchy at a time when it needed stability and unity. The palace's response was swift and carefully calculated. A brief statement emphasized the family's commitment to working through their differences privately while reaffirming their dedication to duty and service. The subtext was clear. Harry's public airing of grievances went against royal protocol and family values. Yet Harry noticed that the statement did not directly contradict any of his claims, perhaps because palace officials knew he had been truthful in his account. In the days following the interview, Harry found himself experiencing an unexpected mixture of emotions. Relief at finally telling his story was tempered by anxiety about the consequences for his remaining family relationships. He had known that speaking publicly would likely damage his connections with his father and brother in the short term, but seeing the reality of that damage play out in real time was more painful than he had anticipated. Meghan proved to be his steadiest support during this turbulent period. She had experienced her own share of public criticism and understood the peculiar anguish of being misrepresented in the media while being unable to respond effectively. Her perspective as someone who had grown up outside the royal system helped Harry maintain clarity about why they had made their difficult choices. The interview's impact on their children became a particular concern. While they were still young enough to be largely shielded from media coverage, Harry worried about how their royal heritage would affect them as they grew older. He was determined to ensure they understood their family history without being burdened by its complications, a delicate balance that required constant attention. Professional opportunities began emerging in unexpected ways following the interview. Publishers approached him about book deals, streaming services expressed interest in documentary projects, and speaking bureaus offered lucrative engagements around the world. While Harry was selective about which opportunities to pursue, the financial independence these ventures provided felt essential to maintaining their family's security and autonomy. His charitable work expanded significantly during this period. Free from the constraints of royal neutrality, Harry could speak more forcefully about issues he cared about, from climate change to social justice to veterans' affairs. The Archewell Foundation, which he had established with Meghan, grew rapidly as donors responded positively to their more direct approach to advocacy. The most significant development came several months after the interview, when Harry received an unexpected phone call from his father. The conversation was brief and somewhat formal, but it represented the first direct communication they had shared since the interview aired. Charles expressed his hurt about some of Harry's public comments while also acknowledging that some of the concerns raised deserved serious consideration. This tentative outreach led to a series of private conversations over secure video calls, with both men carefully avoiding topics that might inflame old wounds while trying to rebuild some foundation of trust. Progress was slow and often frustrating, but the mere fact that they were talking again felt like a significant step forward. Harry's relationship with William remained more complicated. The brothers' different roles within the royal hierarchy made reconciliation more challenging, as William had to consider not only personal feelings, but also institutional implications of any rapprochement with his estranged brother. Their communication remained limited to brief, formal exchanges through intermediaries. The Queen's declining health during this period added urgency to Harry's desire for family reconciliation. Despite their disagreements about his choices, he maintained deep respect and affection for his grandmother, recognizing her lifelong dedication to duty and service. Her eventual passing represented both a personal loss and a symbolic end to the era that had defined his early life. King Charles's coronation presented Harry with one of his most difficult decisions yet. Attending would signal his desire for reconciliation, but might also suggest acceptance of the system he had rejected. Not attending would be seen as a final break with his family and heritage. After extensive discussions with Meghan and his advisors, Harry chose to attend the ceremony as a private citizen, a compromise that satisfied no one completely but felt authentic to his complicated position. The coronation itself proved to be an emotional experience for Harry. Seeing his father assume the role he had prepared for his entire life, witnessing the pageantry and tradition that had surrounded his childhood, and interacting briefly with family members he had not seen in months all reinforced the complexity of his feelings about his royal heritage. As years passed following the interview, Harry found himself settling into a new rhythm of life that balanced his public advocacy with his private family responsibilities. He had learned to ignore much of the ongoing media speculation about his choices and relationships, focusing instead on the work he found meaningful and the family he was building in California. The distance from London provided perspective on both the benefits and costs of his decision to step back from royal duties. While he missed aspects of his former life, particularly the direct service to charitable causes that royal patronages had enabled, he valued the freedom to speak his mind and raise his children away from constant public scrutiny. His hopes for the future remained cautiously optimistic. The royal family had shown some capacity for evolution in response to changing social expectations, and Harry believed that continued pressure for modernization might eventually create space for different models of service and duty. His own example might inspire others within the system to consider alternative approaches to royal life. The interview had achieved its primary goal of allowing Harry to tell his story in his own words, but its broader impact continued to unfold in ways he had not anticipated. Conversations about mental health, family dysfunction, institutional reform, and the balance between public duty and private happiness gained momentum partly as a result of his willingness to speak openly about these difficult topics. Looking back on the journey that had brought him to this point, Harry recognized that his decision to step back from royal duties represented just one chapter in a longer story that was still being written. The boy who had lost his mother too young, the young man who had struggled with his identity and purpose, and the father determined to break cycles of dysfunction had all contributed to the person he had become. His relationship with his royal heritage would always be complicated, marked by both pride in his family's service and frustration with its limitations. But Harry had found peace in the knowledge that he had chosen authenticity over ease, truth over tradition, and love over duty when those values came into conflict. The price had been high, but he remained convinced that some costs were worth paying for the freedom to live according to one's own values and convictions. The studio lights felt harsh against Harry's face as he settled into the comfortable chair across from the interviewer. This was not his first high-profile interview, but it was certainly the most consequential. Every word would be analyzed, dissected, and potentially weaponized by various factions of the British media and royal commentators. Yet he felt an unexpected calm as the cameras began rolling. The interviewers started with gentle questions about his life in California, allowing Harry to ease into the conversation. He spoke about the simple pleasures of grocery shopping without a security detail clearing the store first, of taking his children to the beach without photographers hiding in the dunes, of the freedom to support causes he believed in without worrying about political implications for the crown. When the questions turned to his decision to step back from royal duties, Harry's demeanor grew more serious. He had rehearsed these answers countless times, but the emotions behind them remained raw. The tipping point, he explained, had not been any single incident, but rather the accumulation of years watching his wife struggle under media scrutiny that felt increasingly personal and hostile. He spoke carefully about the conversations that had taken place behind palace walls, the offers of partial solutions that never quite addressed the core problems his family faced. The institution's reluctance to defend Meghan publicly, even when she was clearly being targeted by racist commentary, had forced him to choose between his loyalty to the monarchy and his duty as a husband and father. The most difficult part of the interview came when discussing his family relationships. Harry's voice caught slightly as he described his grandmother's reaction to their decision. Queen Elizabeth had been more understanding than many had expected, he revealed, recognizing perhaps that the monarchy needed to evolve to survive in the modern world. Her support, even if private and conditional, had meant everything to him. His father's response had been more complex. Charles, who had waited decades for his chance to reign, struggled to understand why his son would voluntarily walk away from a life of service and privilege. Their conversations had been tense, filled with hurt on both sides, and a fundamental disconnect about what the future of the monarchy should look like. The interviewer pressed him about his brother William, and Harry's careful diplomacy showed the depth of his pain. He spoke of their shared childhood, the bond formed in grief after their mother's death, and the gradual drift as their adult responsibilities pulled them in different directions. William's complete embrace of his future role as king contrasted sharply with Harry's growing doubts about the relevance of royal duty in the 21st century. Harry revealed details about the palace's communication strategy that few outsiders had ever heard. He described a complex ecosystem of royal correspondence, palace briefings, and strategic leaks that could build up or tear down individual family members based on the institution's perceived needs. Being on the wrong side of that machine, he suggested, had taught him how powerless even princes could be within the system. The conversation turned to mental health, a subject Harry had become passionate about advocating for in recent years. He spoke openly about his struggles with anxiety and depression, particularly in his 20s when he had felt trapped by circumstances he had not chosen. The traditional royal approach of suffering in silence had nearly broken him, leading to a period of reckless behavior that had provided tabloid fodder for years. Therapy had been transformative, he explained, but accessing it had required going against generations of royal tradition that viewed psychological help as weakness rather than strength. The palace's concern about how his mental health advocacy might reflect on the family had been another source of tension, particularly when he wanted to share more personal details about his own struggles. His military service emerged as a recurring theme throughout the interview. Those years in the army represented the happiest and most purposeful period of his life, when he could contribute meaningfully to something larger than himself without the complications of royal protocol. The bonds formed with fellow soldiers, the clarity of mission, and the genuine respect he earned through his actions rather than his birthright had shown him what authentic service looked like. When discussing his current work, Harry's energy shifted noticeably. He spoke passionately about his various charitable endeavors, from supporting veterans to promoting mental health awareness to championing environmental causes. Free from the constraints of royal neutrality, he could now advocate more forcefully for issues he cared about, even if it meant taking controversial positions. The interviewer asked about his financial independence, a subject that had generated significant criticism. Harry explained the necessity of becoming financially self-sufficient after losing royal funding, and defended the commercial ventures that had enabled him to maintain his family's security while supporting their charitable work. The suggestion that he was somehow profiting from his royal connections stung, he admitted, but the reality of supporting a family in the public eye required difficult compromises. Perhaps the most revealing portion of the interview came when Harry discussed his hopes for the future of the monarchy. Despite everything that had happened, he remained surprisingly optimistic about the institution's ability to modernize and remain relevant. He spoke of a slimmed-down monarchy that could be more efficient and more connected to ordinary people's lives, freed from some of the archaic protocols that had constrained previous generations. His children's relationship with their royal heritage emerged as a particularly poignant topic. Harry was determined to ensure they understood their family history and connections while also having the freedom to choose their own paths. The balance between honoring the past and embracing the future seemed to encapsulate his broader philosophy about the monarchy's evolution. As the interview progressed, Harry's initial nervousness gave way to something approaching relief. After years of having his words filtered through palace communications departments and media interpretations, he was finally able to speak directly to the public about his experiences and motivations. The weight of carrying untold stories for so long had been heavier than he had realized. The interviewer's questions about potential reconciliation with his family clearly touched a nerve. Harry's responses were measured but hopeful, suggesting that time and space might eventually heal wounds that seemed insurmountable in the immediate aftermath of his departure. He emphasized his continued love for his family members, even as he maintained that his decision to step back had been necessary for his own well-being and that of his wife and children. When asked about regrets, Harry paused for a long moment before responding. He regretted the pain his decisions had caused his grandmother and other family members, he said, but he could not regret protecting his family from a system that had failed to adapt to their needs. Some choices, he reflected, require accepting that there is no perfect solution, only the least harmful among difficult options. The interview concluded with Harry looking directly into the camera, speaking to the British public he had served for decades in various capacities. His message was both an explanation and an appeal for understanding, acknowledging that his choices might be difficult for some to accept, while hoping that his honesty might contribute to important conversations about tradition, family, and the courage required to forge a different path. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Frogmore Cottage as Harry Windsor sat in his favorite armchair, a cup of tea growing cold in his hands. The silence was different here in California, far removed from the bustling corridors of Buckingham Palace where he had spent most of his childhood. At 39, the Duke of Sussex found himself in an unexpected position, thousands of miles away from the institution that had defined his entire existence. His phone buzzed with yet another message from his private secretary, reminding him about the upcoming interview that would change everything. For months, journalists had been requesting exclusive access to hear his side of the story, to understand the man behind the headlines that had dominated British tabloids for years. Today, he would finally break his silence in a way that felt authentic to who he had become. Meghan entered the room quietly, their children's laughter echoing from the garden where they played with their security detail. She had been his anchor through the most turbulent years of his life, helping him navigate decisions that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. Her presence reminded him that some choices, no matter how difficult, had led to profound happiness. The decision to step back from royal duties had not been made lightly. Harry remembered the countless sleepless nights, the heated discussions with palace advisors, and the weight of disappointing his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth. The institution that had protected and constrained him in equal measure suddenly felt suffocating when he realized it might do the same to his wife and children. Growing up as the spare heir had taught him valuable lessons about duty and service, but it had also shown him the price of living under constant scrutiny. Every mistake was magnified, every relationship dissected by the press, and every attempt at normalcy became front-page news. The trauma of losing his mother, Princess Diana, at such a young age had shaped his understanding of how dangerous the royal fishbowl could become. His military service had been the one period when he felt truly useful, truly himself. In Afghanistan, he was Captain Wales, not Prince Harry. His fellow soldiers cared about his ability to do his job, not his bloodline or his latest romantic entanglement. Those years in the army had given him perspective on what genuine service looked like, and it did not always align with the ceremonial duties that filled his royal calendar. The breaking point had come gradually, then, all at once. Small incidents accumulated like drops of water filling a bucket until it finally overflowed. The relentless media attention on Meghan, the subtle and not-so-subtle racist undertones in much of the coverage, and the palace's seeming inability or unwillingness to protect his family had forced his hand. Harry walked to the window, watching his children play in the California sunshine. They would grow up differently than he had, with more freedom to choose their own paths, but also without the automatic sense of purpose that came from being born into service. It was a trade-off he was still learning to navigate, even years after making the decision to leave. The interview loomed large in his mind because it represented an opportunity to explain rather than simply endure. For too long, he had watched others tell his story, often getting crucial details wrong or missing the emotional complexity of his journey. The narrative of the ungrateful prince who abandoned his duty for Hollywood glamour was too simplistic to capture the reality of what had driven him across an ocean. His relationship with his father, now King Charles, remained complicated. There was love there, certainly, but also hurt and misunderstanding. Charles had lived his entire life preparing for the throne, and perhaps he could not fully comprehend why his younger son would walk away from a life of privilege and responsibility. Harry understood his father's perspective even as he stood firm in his own choices. William, his older brother and heir to the throne, represented another source of pain and regret. Their childhood bond, forged in the shared trauma of their mother's death, had been strained by the very different paths their lives had taken. William had embraced his destiny as future king with characteristic determination, while Harry had questioned whether the monarchy had room for someone like him. The palace machinery that had once protected him now seemed to work against him in subtle ways. Leaked stories, strategic briefings, and carefully orchestrated photo opportunities all served to maintain the institution's image, sometimes at the expense of individual family members. Harry had learned to recognize these tactics, having been both beneficiary and victim of them over the years. As the appointed interview time approached, Harry felt a familiar mixture of anxiety and relief. Anxiety about how his words would be received, particularly by his family, and relief at finally being able to speak his truth without palace filters or media interpretation. The decision to participate in this interview was itself a statement about his new independence and his commitment to controlling his own narrative. His therapist had helped him understand that speaking openly about his experiences was not an act of betrayal, but rather one of healing. The royal family's traditional approach of never complaining and never explaining had served the institution well for generations, but it had also prevented honest conversations about mental health, family dynamics, and the human cost of public service. The weight of royal expectations had shaped every aspect of his early life, from the clothes he wore to the friends he made to the careers he could consider. Breaking free from those expectations had been liberating, but also terrifying, like stepping off a cliff without knowing if there was solid ground below. Meghan joined him at the window, and together they watched their children play. This was what they had fought for, the right to raise their family away from the goldfish bowl of royal life, to give their children choices that Harry had never had. The price had been steep, including the loss of royal patronages that had meant so much to him, and the cooling of family relationships that might never fully recover. The interview would be his attempt to bridge that gap, to explain his decisions in his own words, and perhaps open a door to future reconciliation. He had no illusions that one conversation would solve years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding, but it might plant seeds for future healing. As he prepared for what would become one of the most significant interviews of his life, Harry reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From troubled teenager acting out his grief in public to military officer finding his purpose in service to husband and father building a new life on his own terms, he had traveled further than the miles between London and California could measure.